Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Le poète se fait voyant par une langue immense et raisonnée de règlement de tous les sens. The poet makes himself a seer by a long, vast, reasoned arrangement of all the senses. This famous quote from a letter to Paul Demeny from Rimbaud, dated 1871, neatly encapsulates the subject matter of this paper, that is, the relationship of the poetical, the mystical, and the psychotic. In what follows, I shall endeavour to examine a number of literary works which I think shed light, pun intended, on the attempts to understand the nature of the mystical experience, its typology, causation, and the possibilities of its induction by what Christopher Partridge has called technologies of transcendence. Firstly, however, we need to do some groundwork on terminological considerations. With regard to the induction of alterations in consciousness by drug use, to which are attributed religiosity, there comes the question of which term to use. Each word has its own freighted usage. The most commonly used term psychedelic, meaning mind manifesting, has come to be associated with 50s beatnik poets and 60s counterculture which followed. It was born of a literary exchange between the English psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond and Aldous Huxley, in which the former had quipped with the famous line, "To fathom hell or soar angelic, just take a pinch of psychedelic." The term already presumes that the use of the drug enables the cleansing of the doors of perception, and I would argue that it comes with too much presumptive baggage to be of use. Likewise, the psychiatric term psychotomimetic is pathologizing and assumes a derangement of the senses is taking place which mimics psychosis. I shall consider later the degree to which this mimicry is an accurate description of the drug-induced altered state. Perhaps I should suggest at the outset that the use of the neutral term psychotropic might stand us in good stead. Aside from anything else, it also puts the notion of altered states of consciousness in context. Anyone who takes a psychotropic drug, be it an antidepressant, an antipsychotic, or a sedative hypnotic, has their consciousness altered. Sleep is also an altered state. Anyway, having concluded my word bashing for the moment, we should move swiftly on to consider our first pair of authors, Thomas de Quincey and Charles Baudelaire. Thomas de Quincey, 1785-1859, is most famous for his autobiographical Confessions of an English Opium Eater, published anonymously in 1821. Already florid and digressive in style, this work was made more labyrinthine still by the addition in 1856 of further elaborations which are generally now considered superfluous. A further complication is Baudelaire's translation of a condensation of the 1821 edition, which also included interpolations from the later work Suspiria de Profundis. In these confessions, de Quincey propounds on a series of events by means of which he proffers the antecedents for the opium visions which he had experienced. He describes in some detail both the pleasurable and painful effects of opium use. From a phenomenological perspective, the visions of cityscapes and so on that de Quincey's word images present are difficult to describe, and there has been speculation in the secondary literature as to whether they constitute hypnagogic, i.e. between wake and sleep visions, oniric, i.e. those occurring in dream sleep, or eidetic, intense mental imagery. Rather than what he describes as the torpor of the Turk, he asserts a sense of tranquility in which he can sit and look out over the sea from sunrise to sunset. Initially taken for a painful stomach complaint and severe rheumatic facial pain, which sounds like trigeminal neuralgia, de Quincey's addiction and its associated suffering eventually took hold. Nevertheless, he refers to the experiences with a religiosity, which can be considered as the beginning both of the literary tradition of drug writing, but also that use given a religious aspect. Following on from his comments on the mystical contemplation of the ocean, and particularly significant for our esoteric concerns, is his comment that I shall be charged with mysticism, Bemonism, quietism, and so on, but that shall not alarm me. It is probably not surprising that he would not be alarmed by these accusations, given that he was the secretary of one Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who certainly was a student of Burma and German philosophy in general. Indeed, de Quincey repeatedly informs the reader that he has read Kant and the post-Kantian idealism of Fichte and Schelling. This idealism reveals itself in the dualism between matter and form, which he describes, for example, in the enhancement of the pleasure of music by opium. Music, he asserts, acts on the form of the mind rather than the sensual ear. Another aspect of the opium eater, which is frequently drawn attention to, is the presence of Orientalism, notably in the visit of the sinister Malay character. This aspect de Quincey has very much in common with all the authors discussed below, in one form or another, that is, the constructed East. The leitmotifs of the gorgeous, silk-brocaded, arabesque furnishings, both real and of the Imaginarium, the effete, decadent, tenderly anemic, yet exquisitely refined actors who are coughing up blood, but in a good way. The Orient has demonstrated... the Orient, as demonstrating life in extremis, a liminality expressive of the exhilaration of the risk of drug use and of death threatened at the next exhalation. As an aside, I am using the term Orientalism here in a relatively neutral way, rather than the usual adoption of the canonical inflection of Edward Said's book of the same name. In some ways, for the ultimate locus classicus of European Orientalism, we must travel back in time to the bel monde of 19th century Paris and the literary habitué of the Hôtel Pinaudon and Charles Baudelaire. From 1843 to 1845, Baudelaire lived at the hotel and associated with such intellectual luminaries as, here we go, Théophile Gautier, Victor Hugo, and Gérard de Nerval, who as members of the notorious Club des Hachichins met together consuming hashish in the form of the Moroccan paste marjoun to dance the night away in the willing arms of Mary Jane. So what did and what do our Hachichin experience? The phenomenology of consciousness altered by cannabis is somewhat different from the hypnagogic visions and intense eidetic imagery induced by opiates. There is the experience of what I have termed spatiotemporal dilation. You'll forgive this rather science fiction sounding term, but I am attempting to express something beyond simple extension. The lengthening of time can be vast. Théophile Gautier remarked that it took him 20 years to descend the staircase at the Hôtel Pinaudon. The horizon warps to infinity. The separation of self and external object melts away in a subject-object resolution, sensually redolent of mystical union. Baudelaire evoked this particular phenomenon in Les Paradis Artificiels. You are seated smoking a pipe. You think you are sitting inside the pipe, but the pipe, rather, is smoking you. You exhale yourself in spirals of blue clouds. Cannabis is also hallucinogenic. It provides for misinterpretations or reinterpretations rather than actual free-floating hallucinations. It is well documented in the history of drug use and writing that the story is peppered with psychiatrists experimenting on themselves. Thus, by way of a personal digression and testimonial, I might add that a colleague of the author of this paper, having consumed marjoun in Tangier in the early 90s, saw a woman walk out into the streets where her white hijab was blown up in the air by the wind, and the colleague wondered to himself what a Dutch nun was doing in Morocco. Lost my place now. Apparently, back at his hotel, the voices of children echoing in the corridor outside his room were the voices of giant children, and he was in the doll's house that they were playing with. Akin to this hallucinogenic aspect is the feeling of extreme significance. Everything is felt to be loaded with meaning, and it is for this clinical reason that I would beware of the use of such terms as psychedelic gnosis. The actual feeling of significance is a product of the drug itself. In terms of descriptive psychopathology, and in the context of psychosis, this is termed a delusional mood or delusional atmosphere. and may be present prior to the crystallization of an actual delusional matrix. This often takes on a fearful or persecutory nature. The Hashishin may overinterpret the significance of numbers and letters, where everything appears to be a code to be understood, very similar to Hebrew gematria. As another example, another colleague wrote down a mathematical formula whilst under the influence of cannabis, which he felt was the answer to everything. And the following morning looked at what he had written. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the meaning of life. I think I've made my point. To summarize, if we are to compare the approach of De Quincey and Baudelaire in the evaluation of drug use, we can see that De Quincey, whilst racked with the pain of addiction, still viewed drug use in a positive light, and he sings the praises of opium in no uncertain terms. In the famous passage from the Opium Eater, we read, "Oh, just, subtle and mighty opium, that to the hearts of poor and rich alike, for the wounds that will never heal, and for the pangs that tempt the spirit to rebel, bringest an assuaging balm." And he praises the fantastic imagery of the brain, cities and temples beyond the art of Phidias or Praxiteles, beyond the splendor of Babylon. Baudelaire had a much more negative attitude, perhaps as a reflection of a propensity to a rather dismal Catholic acosmism. In a much more sober tone, he comments, "As I have explained, hashish reveals nothing to the individual but the individual himself." This is perhaps also reflected in the fact that De Quincey lived into an old age, whereas the somewhat paradoxically decadent and conflicted Baudelaire was dead at 46, ravaged by syphilis and cognac. In passing, we have touched on the subject of the nature of the drug experience in relation to the mystical experience. Is the purported gnosis that is experienced by the drug user the same as that experienced by the anchorite? Is there such a division as that between mysticism, sacred and profane? To attempt to answer these questions, we shall now move on to consider the dialogue between two authors on either side of this argument. The famous author and philosopher Aldous Huxley and the professor of Eastern religions at Oxford, Robert Zehner. The discussion focuses on the differing interpretations of the personal experiences of the drug mescaline by both authors, as presented by Huxley in The Doors of Perception, published in 1954, to which, by way of a somewhat polemical response, Zehner wrote Mysticism, Sacred and Profane, an inquiry into some varieties of preternatural experience, 1957. We begin then with Huxley and The Doors of Perception. As is well known, the title alludes to the line from William Blake's poem, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. Huxley's work describes in a grandiloquent, not to say prolix style, the hyperesthetic changes of consciousness following mescaline ingestion, and Huxley's religio-philosophical interpretation. The changes in colour perception are memorable, in particular his wonder at the sight of a vase of flowers. Huxley takes up the story. At breakfast that morning, I had been struck by the lively dissonance of its colours, but that was no longer the point. I was seeing what Adam had seen on the morning of his creation, the miracle moment by moment of naked existence. In this image, produced through the wry eye of Cecil Beaton, we see a young Huxley tearing through the veil, perhaps to see this naked existence that he would write about in such florid terms years later. As if to contrast directly with the opium reveries of cityscapes and citadels experienced by De Quincey, Huxley writes, I saw no landscapes, no enormous spaces, no magical growth and metamorphosis of buildings, nothing remotely like a drama or a parable. The other world to which mescaline admitted me was not the world of visions. It existed out there in what I could see with my eyes open. The great change was in the realm of objective fact. For Huxley, mescaline enabled him to see the world as it is, and borrowing a term from Meister Eckhart, the istigkeit, the isness. It is significant that Huxley, steeped in Eastern philosophy, and the author of Perennial Philosophy, which stresses the similarities of Eastern and Western religious and mystical traditions, would write of his experience that words like grace and transfiguration came to mind, and then go on to state in the same passage that the beatific vision, Sat Chit Ananda, being, awareness, bliss, for the first time I understood, not on the verbal level, not by inchoate hints or at a distance, but precisely and completely what those prodigious syllables referred to. These passages particularly emphasize the importance of set and setting in the studies of drug use. In Huxley's case, his set, i.e. mindset, being that of a perennialist that interpreted his experiences in terms of this thesis, and the setting being a pleasant study where he contemplated flowers. It was Huxley's perennialism that drew the ire of Robert Zehner. It might be mentioned at the outset that Zehner's mysticism, sacred and profane, reads like one long passage of personal affront. He was an unabashed Christian apologist and remarks in the book that he had found himself once again a Christian, having entered the Roman Catholic Church in 1946. Thus, he particularly took umbrage at the notion that mescaline use gave Huxley access to the beatific vision. As a comparativist and professor of Eastern religion, he objected to the perennialist approach, preferring, understandably enough, to see difference where Huxley saw similarity. Remarking on Huxley's combined interest in the drug experience and Eastern philosophy, Zehner writes, "Struck by the similarity of thought and expression he found in all mystics, whether Hindu, Buddhist, Taoist, Muslim, or Christian, he reached the comforting conclusion that behind the great religions of the world there could be determined a philosophia perennis, an ultimate truth of which all religions were only partial expressions." Huxley, he goes on to say, was particularly attracted to the traditions of India, notably Vedanta and Mahayana Buddhism. For Zehner, Huxley's turn to a Vedantin way of life was due to a rejection of the modern world and historical Christianity which condoned it. He concludes that when Huxley took mescaline, his mind was already permeated with these Eastern ideas which affected his vision. Unsurprisingly, what Zehner does consider to be an authentic mystical vision ultimately is either a theistic one, communion with the divine, as in Christian mysticism, or the monistic mysticism of the Hindu Brahma-Atman synthesis. The dewdrop slips into the shining sea. Nature mysticism, however, is not really to be considered as mysticism at all. It includes the oceanic feeling of being at one with the cosmos, which is open to anyone. And here, Zehner included the drug experience. In this regard, Zehner himself had taken mescaline, but having had mystical experiences himself, interestingly, prior to his conversion to Catholicism, he dismissed the effects. He wrote, "I would not presume to draw any conclusions from so trivial an experience. It was interesting, and it certainly seemed hilariously funny." Commenting on the experience as reminiscent of Alice through the looking glass, he reported that, like Alice, he was plunged into a world of farce. In the final section of the paper, I shall reflect on some aspects of mystical topology and dovetail this with some thoughts on the relationship with psychosis and related theoretical considerations. We have already briefly considered Zehner's typology of mysticism, and we should briefly consider the characteristics of the mystical experience as described by William James in the Varieties of Religious Experience. The three characteristics of mysticism defined by James are transience, ineffability, and passivity. As with other such attempts at the categorization of the mystical experience, and as we have seen, it says more about the author than the mystical experience per se. James had experimented with nitrous oxide, laughing gas, and much like Huxley, he had come to the conclusion that he had indeed experienced a drug-assisted, authentic mystical experience, which he categorized in this way. These Jamesian criteria are naturally an extreme generalization and certainly subject to critique. How transient is transient, given that LSD may last 8 hours plus? Passivity is also challenging. The idea that one's agency is taken over and one experiences the mysterium tremendum may not entirely tally with the fact that the experience was actively induced by the participant. Ineffability has also been critiqued by Wayne Proudfoot, a few of whose ideas are useful to mention at this final juncture. Throughout this paper, we have been considering experiences which are at the limits of language and which raise questions of causation, epistemology, and ontology. For Proudfoot, describing the experiences as ineffable is an apologetic device, and reading between the lines, a device used to protect the mystical status of the saint. If we can't talk about it, we can't discuss its nature and cause. In the 21st century, in the world of psychopharmacology and neurobiology and modern imaging, these issues are thrown into stark relief. Is a mystical experience just a temporal lobe transient? Have you just blown a few serotonergic neurons? Is it mystic or mystico-mimetic? Is it psychosis? It is at this point that the question of reductionism rears its ugly head. Most people are put off by the term as the explication of one subject in terms of another, as the negative connotation of a reduction in value. But I think, whilst I can't explain the mystical experience to you, I can point a finger at the attempts. What Proudfoot says is useful with regard to reduction. Descriptive reduction is the failure to identify an emotion, practice, or experience under the description by which the subject identifies. For example, saying that Joan of Arc had paranoid schizophrenia, this is unacceptable. Explanatory reduction consists in offering an explanation of an experience in terms that are not those of the subject, and that might not meet with his approval. This is acceptable. For example, the mystical experience is mediated by neurotransmitters. In the last analysis, in any attempt to address the purported authenticity or otherwise of the mystical experience, of paramount importance is the meaning attributed to that experience. That is, we should adopt a hermeneutic approach. As Christopher Partridge has said, while there are good psychopharmacological reasons for the nature of psychedelic experiences, this does not alter the fact that they create spaces within which meaning is made. Conclusions. In conclusion, we have covered quite a lot in my 20 or so minutes, and I would like to briefly summarize my thoughts. I do not think that psychotropic drugs which induce mystical experience are psychotomimetic. Such drugs can produce psychosis when the voice of insight is lost, but they do not mimic psychosis. The voice of insight is an important component of self-reflexivity in terms of the ability to reality test. Self-reflexivity is significant as individuals having a trip are observing themselves experiencing. My own personal thought is that the ultimate unio mystica is non-reflexive, totally unitary, and in the moment, a conative, i.e. affective or emotional, rather than cognitive event. However, the ultimate judge of the authenticity of experience is the individual and the personal meaning attached, i.e. it is a question of hermeneutics. Whatever these experiences are, they are certainly at the core of what makes us human. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. I'm sure there will be questions. Who comes first?
When are we going to Tangier? Why? Morocco. I'm going back.
Well, maybe I can ask a question, which a bit links both previous papers. I was just thinking, listening to Sasha, but it links to your paper as well. I was just wondering, this is a preoccupation of mine, so forgive me for starting something that I find so fascinating. But when you talk about Plato, there is not just the Republic, of course, there's the Phaedrus, with such a strong emphasis on mania, on divine madness. I always think that there's a strong link between this and things like psychedelic experience, etc., that you are talking about. I'm not suggesting that Plato or Socrates were taking psychedelics or anything like that, but I'm just wondering about those connections between these kind of altered states that are being induced and
there are similarities, phenomenological.
And how do you look at that from a psychiatric perspective?
I think, I go back to William James, which is the place of snakes or the place of seraphs. And some people find the place of snakes and some people find the place of seraphs. And you're using the same apparatus, I suppose, the same neurobiological apparatus. It's the meaning attached. The other thing is that there's the question of reality testing. Because a lot of the time with the drug-induced mystical experiences, if you like. You are watching yourself having the experience. It's a self-reflexive experience. Which is why in my own personal view, that is different to Julian of Norwich sitting in her hut, and so suddenly she has that moment of communion or what have you. But I think, yes, they are allied, but they're not the same. And clearly, I mean, obviously somebody can have an acute and transient psychotic episode, which you could describe as a shamanic illness, if you like, the initiatory illness that the shaman is supposed to go through, but they recover. I think the mistake that people make sometimes when they try to look at schizophrenia, for instance, as somehow constructed by psychiatrists as agents of societal control. They forget that it's a chronic, relapsing, severe and enduring mental illness that goes on forever with cognitive decline. So it's not the same as one of these brief, in terms of the chronology, in terms of the diachronic aspect of it, they are very different. So I think there's more difference and similarity from my perspective.
Sorry that Jeff is not here, because I'm sure that he would have a question about this. But
Thanks a lot for the talk, which I found fascinating and covered lots of really, really interesting terrain. I just sort of wondered how you would relate that to some of the more contemporary kind of research into using psychedelics in therapeutic situations, particularly the DMT thing. There's the book, The Spirit Molecule, for example, where actually the author of a book who's involved with, as a doctor with these experiments actually says, well, the only way we can really understand these is the hypothesis that there are actually multiple parallel realities that are intersecting with one another. So it seems to, A, go beyond just the patient, and B, seems to almost adopt a worldview that some people in the psychiatric professions might actually see as, bordering on psychosis itself. So I just wondered if you had any response.
Well, I'm sort of, I cross into two different worlds anyway, so I don't see it, I don't sort of throw these things out of hand. I'm not I'm not an expert on the sort of, the latest psychedelic research, because I'm just my workaday stuff doesn't involve any of this. It can't, we've got guidelines, do you know what I mean? And so I'm a very boring psychiatrist working in Barking, and I just treat mental illness, I don't speculate. I keep my sort of head below the parapet, if you see what I mean. I am interested in the whole idea of it. I've got some unpleasant anecdotes about giving people with schizophrenia LSD. I do have a friend who was Russell Reed, who was actually a pioneer in transgender psychiatry, actually, and he trained partially at the Johns Hopkins University. So years ago, when they were actually, in the 60s and 70s, when they were actually experimenting then with psychedelics, he was watching through a two-way mirror, and they gave a patient with schizophrenia some LSD, and the patient threw the stool through the two-way mirror as they were watching. So I think one has to be aware of the potential risks. It's interesting, actually, that I think that cannabis is more likely to gain approval eventually. Unfortunately, it's in the BMJ this week, actually, so we're bang up to date, that cannabidiol, as the cannabinoid, has been rejected by NICE guidelines, National Institute of Clinical Excellence, for insufficient evidence for the use in intractable epilepsy. So now we know anecdotally for these kids that are sort of fitting all day. You can imagine how horrendous that must be, that they have responded to cannabidiol, but it's not. It's been thrown out for the time being, but I think it will come back again. But I'm not sure about lysergic acid diethylamide.
That'll take a while.
Okay, well, thank you. We are past 11, so we have to move on to the next paper. I'd like to thank Simon again for the paper.